You've already noticed something disturbing, haven't you? That most of your suffering doesn't come from real problems, but from invisible rules you don't even remember accepting. You suffer because you think you should be somewhere else in life. You suffer because your body doesn't fit patterns someone else defined. You suffer because your desires are labeled as wrong, your choices as failures, your existence as insufficient. But here's the truth that Michel Foucault spent his life revealing. Most of this suffering was deliberately constructed and installed in you, not by accident, but by design. You were trained, conditioned, molded to suffer over things that, when analyzed deeply, don't even make sense. And the scariest part, you actively defend the system that imprisons you. You police yourself. You punish your own deviations. You've become your own jailer. Foucault discovered something that power institutions didn't want anyone to know, that the most effective control doesn't come from chains or prisons, but from making you believe you're free, while you voluntarily follow every rule, every norm, every expectation. He showed how hospitals, schools, prisons, and even the way you think about sex, madness, and truth were carefully constructed to produce a specific type of person. A person who self-monitors, self-censors, self-punishes, and calls it normal. Today, I'm going to reveal Foucault's most dangerous discoveries about how you were programmed to suffer, how power operates through you, not just on you, and why recognizing these structures is both liberating and terrifying. Because once you see the invisible bars surrounding your life, you can't ignore them anymore. If you've ever felt like you're living according to a script you never wrote, being judged by standards you never questioned, Foucault has answers that will completely change how you understand your own existence. You probably think your insecurities are natural, that it's normal to worry about your weight, your productivity, your mental sanity, your social status. Foucault would say you're absolutely wrong. These worries aren't natural. They were fabricated, instituted, made necessary by power systems that need you to feel inadequate to function. Let's start with something you've probably never questioned. Why do you feel guilty about not being productive enough? Why does a day without accomplishing tasks feel like waste? Why does genuinely resting without purpose or goal provoke anxiety in you? Foucault studied what he called disciplinary power, the way modern societies control bodies and minds, not through direct violence, but through internalized norms. He looked at institutions like schools, factories, hospitals, and prisons, and realized something shocking. They all operated on the same basic principle: transform human beings into efficient, predictable, self-managed units. In schools, you learn to sit in silence, to follow rigid schedules, to perform tasks when told, to compete for approval. You were trained to value grades over curiosity, obedience over creativity, and most importantly, you learned to constantly compare yourself to others, to measure your worth through external metrics. Foucault called this disciplinary technology, a system that doesn't need guards because you became your own guard. You internalized the surveillance. Now, even alone, you monitor yourself. You check if you're being productive enough, thin enough, successful enough, normal enough. You became what Foucault called a docile subject, someone who self-disciplines so efficiently that external control becomes almost unnecessary. Think about it. How many times today have you already judged yourself? How many times did you compare your progress to some invisible standard? How many times did you feel you should be doing more, being more, producing more? That voice in your head isn't yours. It's the system speaking through you. And here's the really disturbing part. You defend this system. When someone suggests that maybe we don't need to work so hard, that maybe rest is valuable, that maybe constant productivity isn't health, you probably resist. You argue that people need structure, discipline, responsibility. You became the lawyer for your own prison. Foucault called this capillary power, power that flows through every relationship, every interaction, every thought. You're not just controlled by power, you're a channel through which power operates. You transmit it to others. You judge those who don't conform. You punish those who deviate. And you call it helping, maintaining standards, being responsible. But let's go deeper. Foucault wasn't just interested in how power disciplines bodies. He was fascinated by how power creates entire categories of human beings, how it literally invents types of people that didn't exist before. And once these categories exist, you're forced to identify with one of them, limiting who you can be. Think about the category of homosexual. Before the 19th century, people had varied sexual behaviors, but there was no fixed category of homosexual as identity. Foucault showed that it was medicine, psychiatry, and law that created this category, not to liberate people, but to control them better. Once you label something, you can study it, regulate it, normalize it, or pathologize it. And this doesn't just apply to sexuality. Think about all the categories that define your life: normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, productive and lazy, successful and failed, reasonable and mad. Foucault argued these aren't natural categories, they were constructed. And once constructed, they construct you. You begin to see yourself through these lenses, to measure your life by these standards, to suffer when you don't fit perfectly into them. But here's the twist. Categories change. What was considered madness in 1800 is different from 1900, which is different from 2000. What was considered deviant sexual behavior has changed radically. What counts as normal productivity keeps increasing, so you're not failing at being normal. Normal was deliberately designed to be unattainable for most people. Because if everyone felt normal, satisfied, complete, how would power institutions justify their existence? Foucault studied psychiatric hospitals and discovered something shocking. The primary function of these institutions wasn't to cure people. It was to produce the category of madness as something distinct from reason. Once you have this clear distinction, you can use the threat of being labeled mad to control everyone's behavior. People start policing themselves, avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as unstable, irrational, abnormal. And so, without any physical chains, everyone conforms, everyone behaves, everyone silently suffers with their peculiarities, their deviations, their differences, because revealing these things might result in being categorized as other. This works for everything. Fear of being too fat, too thin, too tall, too short. Fear of not making enough money, of not having enough achievements. Fear that your desires are strange, your emotions inadequate, your thoughts disturbing. All these fears aren't about you. They're about categories constructed to make you feel inadequate. And here's the brilliant trick. The system doesn't punish you for failing to meet standards. It makes you punish yourself. You feel guilty, ashamed, anxious. You seek therapy, self-help, productivity hacks, diets, exercise regimens, all to fit better into prescribed categories. You voluntarily pay to be molded into a more docile subject. Foucault saw that modern societies don't need obvious tyrants. They have something much more efficient. They have you, an internalized tyrant that never sleeps, never rests, never stops judging. And because you think this voice is yours, you never think to resist it. If you're starting to feel discomfort, good. That means you're starting to see the bars. Comment below, I see the bars now. Because recognizing is the first step towards something Foucault considered essential. Freedom not as absence of power, but as the ability to recognize how power operates through you. Now let's go where Foucault really becomes dangerous to the status quo. He wasn't just interested in showing how power disciplines bodies and creates categories. He wanted to understand how the very knowledge we consider objective, scientific, true, is actually a form of power in disguise. Foucault argued there's no neutral knowledge. Every truth claim is also a power claim. When a doctor declares you healthy or sick, he's not just describing an objective reality, he's exercising power. He's defining what counts as health, who has authority to make that definition, and what you should do in response. When a psychiatrist diagnoses you, he's not just identifying a pre-existing condition. He's inserting you into a category that has real consequences for your life. You can be medicated, institutionalized, stigmatized, all in the name of objective scientific knowledge. Foucault studied the history of medicine and psychiatry and showed that what counts as illness, disorder, or abnormality has changed radically over time. Not because scientific truth was discovered, but because power relations changed. What was considered hysteria in women in the 19th century, a real disease with real symptoms, real treatments, is now recognized as a construct used to control women who challenged social norms. What was considered sexual perversion, requiring medical intervention, is now seen as normal variation. But here's the crucial point. In the future, many of the categories we accept today as scientific truth will be viewed the same way, as power constructs disguised as objective knowledge. So why do you suffer when an expert tells you that you have a disorder, a deficit, a deficiency? Not necessarily because something is biologically wrong with you, but because you've been inserted into a category that has real power. This category comes with expectations, limitations, treatments, labels. And once labeled, you start seeing yourself through that lens. You become the diagnosis. Foucault wasn't saying diseases aren't real, or that suffering is imagined. He was saying that the way we categorize, understand, and treat suffering is always traversed by power, and recognizing this changes everything. Think about how you understand depression. In the dominant narrative, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, a disease like any other, treated with medication. But Foucault would ask different questions. Why has depression increased so dramatically in recent decades? Is it because more people have chemical imbalances? Or is it because we live in societies that produce conditions that make people profoundly unhappy? And instead of changing those conditions, we medicate individuals. Categorizing depression as an individual disease does something very useful for power. It individualizes suffering. It takes focus away from social, economic, and political structures that produce this suffering en masse. And it places responsibility for fixing the problem on the individual. You're depressed, take a pill, do therapy, practice self-care, but never ask if maybe working 60 hours a week in a meaningless job while barely affording rent might be the real problem. Foucault called this biopolitics, the way modern societies manage populations not just by disciplining individual bodies, but by regulating life itself. Public health, vital statistics, birth rates, life expectancy, everything becomes an object of knowledge and intervention, and you, as an individual, are constantly evaluated in relation to these population norms. Your body mass index, your cholesterol levels, your mental health, your productivity. You've become a data point in a larger system that's constantly measuring, tracking, optimizing, and when you deviate from the norm, you're not just different, you're a problem to be fixed. Here's where it gets really insidious. The system convinces you that constantly monitoring yourself, optimizing yourself, fixing yourself is self-care, it's empowerment. You use fitness apps, you track your calories, your steps, your sleep. You meditate not for peace but to increase productivity. You do therapy not to understand yourself, but to become more functional within a dysfunctional system. You think you're taking care of yourself, but Foucault would say you're performing self-surveillance. You've become your own manager, your own supervisor, your own auditor, and you do it voluntarily, enthusiastically, because you were convinced this is the path to health, happiness, success. But let's examine what happens when you fail these standards, when you gain weight, when your productivity drops, when your health numbers aren't ideal. You don't just feel disappointment, you feel deep shame, guilt, moral failure, because the system implanted the idea that your value as a person is directly tied to your ability to conform to these metrics. You're not just unhealthy or unproductive, you're bad, you're lazy, you're weak. And this moralization isn't accidental. It's how power operates most efficiently, transforming statistical deviations into moral failures. Foucault realized that in modern societies, power doesn't primarily say no. It says yes. It produces. It creates desires, identities, possibilities. But all these possibilities operate within carefully established limits. You can be whoever you want, as long as you're productive. You can express yourself freely as long as you don't challenge fundamental structures. You can pursue happiness as long as you pursue it through consumption, optimization, conformity. And when you fail, when you can't be happy, healthy, successful within these parameters, you don't blame the system. You blame yourself. You seek more self-help, more productivity hacks, more therapy. You double down trying to fit in, and the system loves this because you're doing its work. Now, if this is making you feel hopeless, like you're trapped in a matrix you can't escape, take a deep breath, because Foucault wasn't a nihilist. He was a thinker of resistance, and he believed that where there's power, there's always resistance. But before we get to that, we need to understand the masterpiece of modern power, how it makes you think you're free while controlling you more completely than any tyrant ever could. Foucault studied prisons, not because he was fascinated by criminals, but because prisons reveal something fundamental about how modern societies operate. He wrote about the panopticon, a prison design imagined by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. In the panopticon, there's a central tower from which guards can see all prisoners, but prisoners never know when they're being watched. The result? Prisoners start behaving as if they're always being observed. They self-discipline. Guards don't even need to be in the tower. The mere possibility of surveillance is enough. Foucault argued that the entire modern society operates like a panopticon. You don't know when you're being observed, evaluated, judged, so you act as if you're always under surveillance. You moderate your behavior. You censor yourself. You conform, and all this happens internally. Nobody needs to force you. You force yourself. Think about how you behave on social media. You carefully curate your image. You post things that make you look successful, happy, normal. You avoid sharing anything that might be misinterpreted or judged. You've become your own public relations manager, constantly shaping the narrative of your life for public consumption. And you do this even when nobody's looking, because you internalize the gaze. But it goes deeper. Think about how you behave at work. You arrive early, stay late, respond to emails immediately, always look busy. Not necessarily because all this work is necessary, but because you know you're being evaluated. Your productivity is measured. Your commitment is judged, and even when nobody's watching directly, you act as if there is. You became both prisoner and guard. Foucault called this technology of the self, the ways individuals act upon themselves to produce certain effects. You're not forced to be productive. You make yourself be productive. You're not forced to conform. You conform voluntarily. And all this self-governance is presented as freedom, as choice, as empowerment. But here's the question Foucault forces us to face. If you're constantly molding yourself to meet external expectations, if you're always watching yourself, judging yourself, disciplining yourself, where are you in all this? Who's the person behind all this performance? Have you ever had a moment of real silence where you asked yourself what you really want? Not what you should want, not what would make others happy, not what would fit the image of success, but what you, this strange and unique thing that exists behind all the roles and masks, really desire? Most people can't answer that question. And not because they're stupid or repressed, but because they spent their whole lives learning to ignore their own desires in favor of what's approved, normalized, productive. Foucault was obsessed with this question. How do you create an authentic life in a world that constantly tries to mold you into something useful for its system? And his answer was radical. You practice what he called care of the self, but not self-care in the modern sense of bubble baths and meditation apps. Foucault was talking about something much deeper and more dangerous. He studied ancient philosophers, particularly the Stoics and Cynics, and realized they practiced spiritual exercises meant to transform themselves, not to fit better into society, but to create critical distance from social norm, to develop an ethical relationship with oneself that doesn't depend on external approval. Foucault saw these ancient philosophers as practitioners of freedom. They weren't trying to discover their true inner essence. They were actively creating themselves as works of art, deliberately choosing what kind of person to become. And this choice wasn't based on conforming to external ideals, but on developing an ethical relationship with oneself. This is where Foucault becomes radically liberating. He's saying you don't need to discover who you really are. You need to invent yourself. You're not a fixed truth waiting to be discovered. You're a possibility to be created. And this creation happens through practices, through choices, through experimentation. But there's a problem. Society hates when you start creating yourself outside its approved categories, when you stop seeking approval, when you question norms, when you live in ways that aren't immediately intelligible within existing frameworks. You become dangerous, not because you're violent, but because your very existence challenges the system. Foucault lived this personally. He was openly gay at a time when it was both illegal and pathologized. He experimented with drugs, unconventional relationships, limit experiences. He didn't do this for adolescent rebellion, but as philosophical practice. He was testing the limits of what's possible, exploring forms of existence that weren't predefined, creating himself as an ethical project. And here's what's crucial. Foucault wasn't saying you should do what he did. He was saying you should experiment, question, explore, that you should treat your life as a work of art you're constantly creating, not to fit some aesthetic ideal, but to develop an ethical relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on external norms. This means asking dangerous questions. Why do I believe I need a successful career to be valuable? Why do I believe my body needs to look a certain way? Why do I believe certain desires are shameful? Why do I believe I should follow this specific life path? And then, even more dangerously, starting to experiment with different answers. What if I don't need to? What if these beliefs aren't truths, but just norms I internalized? What if I could live differently? Foucault called this practice of freedom, and the word practice is crucial. Freedom isn't a state you achieve. It's something you practice continuously. You're never totally free from power. Power is everywhere, traversing every relationship, every thought, every choice. But you can develop a conscious relationship with power. You can recognize when you're being shaped by external forces, and you can resist, experiment, create gaps where new possibilities emerge. This isn't easy. It requires tremendous courage because it means going against the current. It means disappointing people. It means being misunderstood. It means giving up the security that comes from following the script. But Foucault would argue the alternative is worse. The alternative is living an entire life following rules you never questioned, pursuing goals you never chose, suffering over problems that were never really yours. Now let's talk about Foucault's most disturbing discovery, how modern power operates not primarily through repression, but through production. It doesn't say no, it says yes. It doesn't prohibit, it encourages. But everything within carefully managed limits. Think about sexuality. The common narrative is that modern societies liberated sexuality from Victorian repression. Now we can talk about sex, have sex, explore sex. Freedom, right? Foucault said, wait a moment, look closer. He wrote volumes on the history of sexuality and showed that modern societies didn't liberate sexuality. They proliferated it, they multiplied it, they created infinite categories, endless discourses, endless experts, all talking about sex. But all this discourse, all this exploration, all this apparent freedom still operates within very specific norms. Healthy sex versus unhealthy, normal versus perverse, productive versus wasteful. And you're encouraged to explore, but only within these approved categories. You're encouraged to talk about your experiences, but only in ways that conform to recognizable narratives. And if you deviate, if your desires don't fit neatly into available categories, then you're back to being a problem, something to be studied, treated, normalized. So apparent freedom is actually a more sophisticated form of control. You're free to be whoever you want, as long as who you are is intelligible within existing power categories. This applies to everything. You're free to choose your career, as long as you choose something productive. You're free to express your identity, as long as it's a recognizable identity that can be categorized, studied, marketed. You're free to pursue happiness, as long as you pursue it through consumption, work, conformity. And when you fail to be happy within these parameters, when you feel empty despite doing everything right, this isn't seen as a failure of the system. It's seen as your personal failure. You need more therapy, more coaching, more optimization. The system is fine. You're the one who's defective. Foucault called this productive power, and it's much more efficient than direct repression because it makes you think you're free while controlling you completely. You voluntarily choose to conform. You enthusiastically seek your own normalization. You police your own thoughts, desires, behaviors, and you call it personal growth, self-care, responsibility. But here's where Foucault offers hope. If power is productive, if it's constantly creating new possibilities, then resistance is also productive. Every power configuration creates points of resistance. Every system has cracks, gaps, spaces where something new can emerge. And you, as a conscious individual, can look for these cracks. You can experiment with forms of life that aren't fully captured. You can create practices that disrupt normal logic. You can refuse to be totally intelligible. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit or totally rejecting society. It means developing what Foucault called a critical attitude, a disposition to always question, to not accept things as inevitable, to ask yourself, how did this come to be? Could it be different? What's being excluded by this particular configuration? When you start asking these questions, everything changes. You stop seeing the world as fixed, natural, inevitable. You start seeing structures, contingencies, choices that created current conditions. And if it was constructed, it can be reconstructed differently. So, let's be practical. What does this mean for your real life? How do you actually practice freedom in a world saturated with power? Foucault offers some guidelines. First, question your certainties, especially those that seem most natural, most obvious, most necessary. These are often the most constructed. Why do you believe you need a full-time job to be respectable? Why do you believe your worth is tied to your productivity? Why do you believe certain life forms are superior to others? Second, experiment. Treat your life as a laboratory. Test small transgressions. What happens if you say no when you'd normally say yes? What happens if you stop apologizing for taking up space? What happens if you explore a desire you always repressed? You don't need to make dramatic changes. Small experiments reveal where norms are operating. Third, cultivate relationships that allow experimentation. Foucault emphasized the importance of friendship as a space of freedom. Not friendship in the superficial sense, but deep relations where you can be seen without judgment, where you can explore possibilities, where you can be strange, incomplete, contradictory. These relations become laboratories for alternative forms of existing. Fourth, develop practices that create distance from norms. Meditation, writing, art, anything that allows you to observe your own thoughts and notice when you're just repeating internalized scripts. Foucault kept extensive journals where he analyzed his own thoughts and behaviors, not to confess or purify himself, but to understand how he was being constituted by forces around him. Fifth, recognize you'll always be partially captured by power. There's no pure exterior. There's no position of complete autonomy. You're always negotiating, always in relation, always partially shaped by forces you don't totally control. And that's okay. Freedom isn't escaping power. It's having a conscious and critical relationship with it. Sixth, show solidarity with others who are experimenting. Foucault was deeply political. He believed individual freedom practice connects with collective struggles. When you question norms in your own life, you open space for others to do the same. Your small resistances connect with larger networks of transformation. And finally, treat your life as a work of art in progress, not as a project with a fixed endpoint, but as a continuous practice of creation. You're constantly making and remaking yourself, and this is a profound ethical responsibility, not to meet external standards, but to develop an ethical relationship with yourself. Now, I know this might seem abstract, so let me give concrete examples of how this works. You're in a job that drains you. The normal narrative says, work harder, Be more productive, prove your worth. The Foucauldian approach asks, why do I accept that my worth is tied to productivity? Who benefits from this norm? What would be possible if I rejected this equation? Maybe you experiment with setting boundaries, refusing to work overtime, stopping answering emails at night, and observe what happens, not just externally, but internally. Observe the guilt, anxiety, fear. These are internalized norms resisting, but also observe if any space opens up, any possibility of different life, or you struggle with body image. The normal narrative says, lose weight, get fit, meet the standard. The Foucauldian approach asks, where does this standard come from? How does it serve certain interests? What would be possible if I completely rejected this metric of value? Maybe you experiment with stopping weighing yourself, stopping counting calories, stopping comparing yourself to images, and observe. Not to replace one norm with another, but to create space where you can discover what relationship you want to have with your body outside these prescriptions. Or you feel trapped in relationships based on expectations. The normal narrative says, commit, be faithful, follow the script. The Foucauldian approach asks, what forms of intimacy are possible beyond prescribed model? What would be possible if I created relationships based on honest negotiation instead of assumed norms? Maybe you experiment with radically honest conversations about desires, boundaries, possibilities, not to break rules for breaking's sake, but to discover what forms of connection actually serve everyone involved. See, the point isn't that you should do these specific things. The point is you should question, experiment, create. You should treat the norms governing your life not as truths, but as possibilities that can be accepted, modified, or rejected. And this process of questioning and experimentation, that's freedom, not as a final state, but as a continuous practice. Now, Foucault has one more crucial insight. He studied the history of what we call truth and discovered that what counts as truth changes radically depending on power configuration. In the Middle Ages, truth was revealed through religious authority. In the modern era, truth is revealed through science, experts, data. But both are power configurations. Both decide who can speak, what can be said, how truth is verified. So when an expert tells you a truth about yourself, about your body, your mind, your sexuality, don't accept blindly. Ask, where does this truth come from? Who has authority to pronounce it? What does it make possible and what does it exclude? This doesn't mean rejecting all expert knowledge. It means having a critical relationship with it, recognizing it's always partial, always situated, always traversed by power. And this opens space for your own knowledge, your own experience, your own wisdom about your life. Foucault believed in something he called subjugated knowledge. Knowledges that have been disqualified, marginalized, excluded from official discourses. The knowledge of ordinary people about their own lives. The knowledge of marginalized groups about their own experiences. These knowledges are often more true, more useful, more liberating than expert pronouncements. So trust yourself, trust your experience, not naively but critically. You know things about your life that no expert can know. You have knowledge that comes from living, from suffering, from experiencing, and this knowledge is valuable, precious, necessary. And when you start honoring your own knowledge, something powerful happens. You stop waiting for authorities to tell you who you are and what to do. You start becoming the authority over your own life, not arrogantly, but responsibly. You take ethical responsibility for creating yourself. Let me summarize what Foucault revealed. You were trained to suffer over things that don't even make sense. Trained to judge yourself by standards constructed to keep you docile, productive, controllable. Trained to watch yourself, punish yourself, normalize yourself. All in the name of health, normality, success. But these categories aren't natural truths. They're historical constructs traversed by power. And once you see this, once you recognize the bars, you can't ignore them anymore. But you also don't have to be destroyed by them. You can practice freedom, question, experiment, create. You can develop an ethical relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on external approval. You can treat your life as a work of art you're constantly creating. And this isn't selfishness. This isn't irresponsibility. It's the opposite. It's taking ethical responsibility for not being governed this way, for not accepting these truths, for not being this type of subject. Foucault lived this. He questioned everything, experimented with everything, created a life that didn't fit neatly into any category. And yes, he paid costs. He was misunderstood, criticized, marginalized, but he also lived with an intensity, honesty, freedom that few experience. And when he died, he left a legacy that continues liberating people, because he showed that power isn't invincible, that norms aren't inevitable, that there's always possibility of resistance, of creation, of transformation. So if you're suffering over things that don't make sense, if you're exhausted from trying to fit into molds that weren't made for you, if you're tired of being governed by norms you never questioned, remember Foucault. Remember you're not alone. Remember the suffering you feel isn't natural. It's produced, and what was produced can be dismantled. You can start today with a simple question. Why? Why do I accept this? Where does this norm come from? Could it be different? And then, even more dangerously, you can experiment. Small transgressions, small resistances, small acts of creation, and slowly, imperceptibly, you start freeing yourself, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to breathe, enough to see possibilities, enough to live. If this message resonated with you, if you started seeing the bars, if you're ready to practice freedom, subscribe to this channel. Here we explore dangerous thinkers, radical ideas, possibilities that dominant systems prefer to keep hidden. Share this video with someone trapped in suffering that doesn't make sense. And in the comments write, I question my certainties, because that's the first step. Recognizing that what seems most natural might be most constructed. And once you see this, everything changes. You were trained to suffer, but you can untrain yourself. You can free yourself. You can create something new. And Foucault would be smiling, because that's exactly what he wanted. Not followers of his ideas, but practitioners of freedom. People who question, experiment, create. People who refuse to be governed this way. People like you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.